Hey everyone. So this lecture is about social movements. This is a kind of spin-off of interest groups and what we've been talking about. But this is how people mobilize in public in kind of a grassroots manner, so that's a bottom-up manner, to create change. So what are social movements? They're not as rigid as interest groups. They are loosely organized collections of people, and they are working outside of established institutions using unconventional and, this is key, disruptive methods to get their voices heard by the public, the media, and the government. So they are outsiders. They aim to promote or undo some social change. There's a shared sense of grievance. There's a common grievance across people involved in these social movements, and eventually they do turn into interest groups. But I want to elaborate on this unconventional tactics and disruptive methods. So here are some social movements and what they do. Social methods alert or movements, excuse me, alert, educate, and inspire the general public who influences power holders. They can also directly influence power holders. You see here, there's protest signs. That's one way to influence um, power holders. And many of the general public join social movements. So, do social movements fit in a democracy? Certainly, they encourage participation, and it allows people to get involved in politics in a way outside of voting, and participation in these movements could increase interest in politics. It also, their social movements also work to overcome political inequalities, and they allow people without resources who would otherwise be barred from politics to enter politics. So political movements can also create new majorities. This creates a situation to convert a large number of people to an idea, to get a new majority on board with a new idea. They can change public opinion in this way. And a big example of this is the LGBTQ community and how quickly perceptions of gay marriage seem to change almost overnight. They can also help overcome constitutional limitations, and the energy of the social movement can overcome difficulties needed to change the Constitution. That is, if there is broad support for something, policymakers can act much faster. An example of this is, of course, the women's rights movement, but we have more. Social movement usually are created out of a reaction. This is much in line with disturbance theory. Safe, content people don't really join protests, they don't join social movements. So they join these movements out of either very real threats or perceived threats. And there is an availability of resources for motivations. You need resources, you need supplies, you need food, you need a network, you need transportation. You need all sorts of things to make sure that mass gatherings of people can show up to be mobilized. Social movements really seem to shoot out in ripe moments. They don't shoot out overnight, and often they don't shoot out when they are first called for. We're going to have an example of what I mean by that on a later slide. Efficacy amongst participants. They can have the ability to produce an effect and a sense that an individual can affect the government. That is what social movements give people. It gives them the sense of satisfaction that they can indeed influence policy. Social movements need a spark to set off the flame, something to set it off. Now, I want to talk about this use of unconventional tactics in the following slides. They draw attention to an issue. Disruption causes attention to an issue, like a mass demonstration, the mobilization of hundreds of people to Washington, D.C. Or strikes, disrupting the economy by pulling workers out and drawing attention to the inequality that workers face. Refusing to work is another disruption. Hunger strikes are another disruption. Civil disobedience, refusing to leave a place, and sitting down in places where you would not be allowed. All of these are examples of social movements and the disruptive tactics involved in them. But social movements also, of course, come with a price. So, why do they succeed? Well, it depends on how close they are to the mood at the time. There's this proximity to the goals of American values. Do these social movements map up with democracy, with this idea of individual liberty? Are they in sync with that, or are they against that? Can they sufficiently win attention and support, or are they very marginalized? And do they have the ability to get their leaders into politics or to affect the leadership ability of people in government? There's some examples of low impact and unsuccessful social movements, like the Poor People's Movement in the 1960s, and of course the failure of the women's movement to get the ERA passed. The women's movement has not been able to do this. This is very unsuccessful. Early labor movements were repressed violently by the US government, but also by private actors who hired their own detectives to make sure that workers wouldn't strike. Very successful movements. Social Security is a direct result of a social movement called the anti poverty movement. And anti abortion movements have been very successful across the government. And of course, the civil rights movement and women's suffrage have been extremely successful. Thank you all, and I'll see you in class this week.